We have the pleasure of being here today to speak about a new film by Renée Mboya. The title of the film that you've just seen is A Glossary of Words My Mother Never Taught Me. And I have had the extraordinary privilege of being in dialogue with Renée around the development of this work over the last 2 years in the context of Forecast. Today, we're happy to welcome Luc Melchiorre to join us. Luc, we're so happy to have someone throw some fresh responses and insights at this work and to have you here in dialogue with us today. And given the fact that we don't have a huge amount of time, I'm just going to hand right over to you, Luc, and ask you to go ahead with your first question for Renée.
Thank you so much, Candice, and congratulations, Renée, on a wonderful piece of work. And of course, I'm very grateful to the Forecast Festival to give us an opportunity to talk about that work in a public forum. I wanted to start with my first question, which addresses the beginning of the film, Renée. You have these beautiful images at the start of the film of fireworks and throngs of people celebrating. And then, of course, later we have the image of Jomo Kenyatta, the father of Kenyan independence, speaking charismatically to a group of people that surround him on all sides. And yet almost immediately, your narration makes us question some of these images. You speak with a close-up of Kenyatta, of a father abandoning his children, failing them, raising them to, as you put it, be afraid all the time and teaching them silence. Your film, at least to me, seems to be interested in how structures of authority are transposed from the family to the nation. Can you talk a little bit about why you opened the film with this sequence? Why is Kenyatta such a central presence in your film? And then finally, what is your film telling us about the relationship between Uhuru, the birth of these new African nations, and the figure of the father?
I don't think that the film was in any way meant to be a reflection, like a holistic reflection on the idea or the moment of Uhuru and or Kenyatta specifically. I was really in many ways trying to reflect on my own childhood and growing up in Kenya at the time of the Moi dictatorship, where this kind of language was very much taken for granted. So the idea of the president of the nation as the father, the idea of the nation itself, the land, the territory as something that embodied as a kind of paternal or maternal presence. Like we very much thought about family and country, or family and country overlapped in the ways in which we spoke about ourselves and about the civic and political space that we inhabited. So I hadn't really encountered Kenyatta in all that much of my research. When I was first thinking about what this film could be, I was very much thinking about the coup, the attempted coup that happened in 1982, which I think is really, in some ways, the beginning of the Nyayo era and cemented like a very specific type of leadership, which is what I then came to experience growing up in the 80s and 90s. So it hadn't occurred to me at all to think and to look at Kenyatta. It's really only through looking at the footage from Africa Blood and Guts that I started to think about what that independence moment might have been, and speaking to the elders, speaking to people that I thought might have been alive or around or aware at the time of independence, but who were in my immediate circle, being like my parents and people of their generation. I kept asking, like, what do you remember about this time? And the thing that struck me was very much the ways that they had learned to think about Kenya, having been born into a place that wasn't necessarily Kenya, or wasn't Kenya for them. I think for the British Empire and for the colonial regime, Kenya was a place that existed administratively and territorially, but for the people that were living there, I don't think that any of them necessarily thought of the place where they were as Kenya. My family is from Trans Nzoia, and this was, the northeastern extreme of the White Highlands. And so looking at Kenyatta and thinking about the idea of the father really overlapped with me thinking about the place that I'm from and the people that are around me I'm from and the kind of language that they had adopted in order to speak about the place that they're from. I think this figure of the father of the nation and the ways in which that language evolves as regimes themselves evolve, as Kenyatta's regime evolved, as Moi's regime evolved, as, you see Mobutu Sese Seko calling himself the Messiah, the guide, the leopard. And by the time we're coming to the late 1990s and his regime is coming to an end, people have a very different articulation of what that means or what that kind of leadership has come to embody. So yeah, I was trying to think about like many different things, and Kenyatta became sort of like a figurehead for my imagination around what Kenya could be, or what the genesis for the idea of the nation of Kenya might have been.
Yeah, I'm very struck by the presence of the authority of paternal figures in these kind of multiple ways that you and Luc have already hinted at in the work. But of course, the father is not the only sort of lurking parental figure. We've already mentioned that the work is titled A Glossary of the Words My Mother Never Taught Me. And in that sense, it points to the way that we're constituting language. We become who we are through language. Often via a so-called mother tongue. Luc has already pointed out that the film asks us really to think about the relationship between biological family and other sort of parental structures or authorities within our lives. And maybe you could speak a little bit about the way that this happens through language as this means by which we find ourselves, but also language as this kind of messy quality which can't always be trusted. Language is something which sometimes fails us, and you hint at this, you mentioned the words that you were never taught by your mother. So I would say that through your lens, or through the lens of this piece, language is not an innocent quantity. Could you speak a little bit about the title of the work and this role that the glossary plays as a kind of structuring device for the piece?
I mean, I think both of you are bilingual, multilingual, and potentially understand there is a certain degree of complexity around the languages that we speak, and when you speak more than one, then it creates, I think, strange conceptual overlaps, because you receive different messages from different languages. And in Kenya in particular, of course, we have our national languages are English and Swahili. Swahili is our national language, and English is our official language. And there is something of a tension, because for, I think, a majority of the nation, Swahili is not their native language, or necessarily even close to their native language. Swahili is, East African coastal language. So a lot of us come to this language. It is, I think, a mother tongue, but it is truncated. It is politicized. It exists it's sort of like the political arena as a language that has been instrumentalized in many ways. And I think of English very much in the same way, because the way that I learned English and the way that I was disciplined in my learning of English and how I speak and how I present myself in English, I thought was an extension of a specific type of colonial education, and an extension in essence of a colonial regime. Many people might not agree. This was a feeling that I had when I started to think about the place of language, the place of movement, the place of location, and how these things overlap and how these things complicate each other necessarily. So was attempting to resolve something for sure. I think Toni Morrison speaks about that language, oppressive language, does more than represent violence. In its own way, it is violence, and it more than represents the limits of knowledge. It limits knowledge. So I was trying to, I think, break out of the limitations that I felt existed in my own languages, and think about a way to overlap the languages that, the words that I do feel confident about, and the languages, or like the elements of the language that I feel within which I feel I am most myself, as a way to sound like myself, or to think about myself as a whole being.
That brings us, actually reminds me of a conversation that the three of us were having earlier, Luke, where, Renée starts to speak about the sort of colonial context as sort of being at the foundation of her work. And I know you had some strong questions about land and land ownership that you wanted to address.
Yeah, thanks, Candice, for that. As a scholar of Kenyan politics, one of the themes of your work that really struck me relates to the politics of land and property, right? And so one of the words that you use in your glossary that you describe and define is the native reserve. And some of the narration from the original documentary, Africa, Blood and Guts, talks about the ability of the settlers to supposedly, as they put it, transform the rough African bush into a little piece of England. The centrality of land, I don't think, is surprising, given that Kenya was, of course, a settler colony where the most fertile land was expropriated by the British colonial state and white settlers. Indeed, as you know, Renée, very well, the politics of land remains very central to how the colonial and post-colonial states came to be formed in Kenya, and it's still very central to the politics of the country. Your film convincingly suggests that there is this close link that exists between history, how it's told and who has the power to tell it, and land and property. And so I was just hoping that perhaps you could talk a little bit about the theme of land and land alienation in your film. And what argument do you think your film is forwarding about how these things relate to one another in the Kenyan context?
I think certainly land is a big theme in the film, but I would argue, and I think you've already alluded to it, that landlessness is a bigger theme potentially. I really wanted to, I think about, I think native reserve, and reserve in particular, was a word that I wanted to think about, because it is a word that is familiar to me, and it's a word that is used, is widely used in my family. And it wasn't until, it was always the word that mostly my aunties, because this is where they live in particular, use to describe the place that they come from. And the way that my family is structured is that the men, these are all my mother's extended relatives, my uncles live in the city center of Kitale and what would have been the colonial farms that are around that area. So these are wealthy areas. These essentially are the areas that would have been the White Highlands. And then as you get less educated and as you get poorer, and as you get, inevitably more gendered, all of the women, the sisters, the aunties, they all live in what was previously the native reserve. So my childhood was very much moving between these two spaces. What was obviously really lush, beautiful, well-farmed, well-planted, vast areas of land, and then kind of dusty little huts on the other side. And so, for me, land has always been moving between these two different states. And I think for many Kenyan families, this is definitely the manifestation of land ownership or landlessness in many ways in the post-colonial moment. But one thing that affected me was that landlessness seemed to affect the women more than it did the men. And yet they were, I think, particularly invested in protecting the lands that they were on and the lands of others. You know, there's always a conversation around inheritance and who land should go to. And so, yeah, I wanted to think about this geography and how it is named, how it is articulated within my own family, but also by who specifically, and what that says about how the ways in which they were privileged to receive education, to receive access to certain resources, and whether or not being so located influenced that.
I'm interested now, if you'll allow me a slight shift in focus, because
Please,
one
yes.
of the things that's fascinating to me about this film is I had not seen, nor was I very aware of this documentary, Africa, Blood and Guts, before we met, before we started talking about this, Renée, over the last couple of years. And I imagine the audience of your film is going to be very interested in what is this documentary, Africa, Blood and Guts, which is, of course, the source material for your own film. Can you tell us a little bit about this documentary? When was it made? By whom? What are the kind of underlying politics of this film? Was it representative of Western films made about Africa in this period? And could you talk a little bit about some of the formal strategies that you've mobilized to ensure that we can't view this footage quite the same way that we might have viewed the original?
Well, Africa, Blood and Guts is a Mondo film that was made in 1966 by the filmmaking duo Jaco Petit and Prosperi, and Mondo films specifically are a subgenre of exploitation films and documentary films. And they made this film at a time when the other films weren't necessarily doing that well. Like they had made quite a reputation for themselves, making these incredibly violent films about places that were considered, I think, by a general Italian public to be strange places. And so, you know, super violent, super sexual stuff basically that had never been seen in film and cinema, had not been seen in film and cinema previously. And they weren't doing well with those films, basically. It wasn't popular anymore to go to the cinema to watch this kind of film. Many people now had televisions in their houses, and so could choose what they wanted to watch. And yeah, so they just simply weren't doing well. And Africa was the last place that they felt was undiscovered, and where they felt that they might be able to bring something to their audiences that was new and different. I have to suppose that they arrived in quote unquote Africa, and it simply wasn't that interesting. You know, people, it's the immediate post, you know, independence moment, and people are just going about their business, you know. And I think in some ways it's quite a nice moment, you know, like who's going to school is going to school, who's building hospitals is building hospitals, everybody's trying to build roads, and like it's definitely a little bit over romantic moment, I think, in 20th century African history. So I think they just couldn't find anything to film, so they take all of this documentary footage that they collect from different filmmakers that are working on the continent, mostly journalists, and they kind of throw it together in this film that became Africa, Africa, Blood and Guts. I think in some respects, they very much stayed true to the tradition of like neo-realist Italian, post-war Italian cinema, because all they do is they make a pseudo-documentary where you have portrayal of real events, and scripted and fictional events kind of overlapping. So yeah, I think for me, it was, I was curious about this film because it seemed in many ways ridiculous. But then it also contained a lot of footage that I hadn't seen before and I thought was quite interesting, and that I wanted to better contextualize. So they don't necessarily name any countries in this film. These places are not real places. They really do construct a mythology around the idea of Africa. yeah, so I wanted to think about, okay, where are these places? What are these people doing? And how might they necessarily have narrated their own positions if they had been asked, or if this had been a documentary that had been made differently? And what do you do with a film like this if is there a possibility to kind of remove this synthetic scare that is very much built into the sound of the film, and the images that are being presented were almost, the original film is almost punctuated by violence or loud noises, or, it's designed to shock you at every turn. So I thought, okay, if without that, is there any value in the images that remain? And is there any way to kind of salvage this archive that I thought was, frankly, a beautiful set of images in some ways?
Renée, maybe I can ask you to expand on that a little bit, because it does feel very much, the making of the piece does feel very much like an act of reclaiming footage, which it does not portray the African continent very favorably. And maybe you can speak firstly to your thinking around this imagery, because so much of it is very violent, so much of it kind of caricatures Africanness. It proposes Africanness as if there were only one kind of Africanness, and kind of collapses Africanness into one thing. So I'm interested in what your thoughts around what it means to appropriate this footage, to take it back and make it your own. And I think that connects directly to this question of what it means for you as a Black woman who is based in Kenya, on the continent, to rewrite the story, to sort of take it up and to, if you like, retell the colonial archive, or insist on new ways of understanding the colonial archive.
Yeah, I think it was in some ways as well an insistence on understanding and retelling myself, or like understanding myself for myself. These caricatures are built into the heritage of image making about and around the continent, but they are also caricatures that we have been taught in many different ways. And they're caricatures that I think to a certain extent recognized, yes, but also accepted about myself and about my own body and the way that it looks. And so recutting and appropriating images from this really quite horrific film was, for me, a way as well of saying that, like, it is okay to look at some things and to take the space and the liberty to free oneself from the burden of what has been told about those places or those specific portrayals. One choice that I made in the film that was particularly difficult was there, early in the film, this period that you were speaking about earlier, Luke, after you see Kenyatta.
Okay, so we're talking more specifically about the source material, Renée, and I have a question around that. For me, parts of the original documentary appear staged, right? So, for example, you have shots of the white housemaids speaking to the African children, and this is always done in close-up, and I think the vocals are dubbed, and I'm thinking here of the close-up in the department store, and then another close-up where one of the white housemaids says to the African child that she mustn't spit the seeds from a piece of fruit that she's eating. And then later we have this remarkable sequence where you have this young African man, as the narration says, playing the fox's part. So he's running away from these white hunters and the hounds. And this is shot in a very cinematic way. So the compositions of the shots, for example, of him running past the village, and you have all the villagers kind of lined up symmetrically. And then you have, when he's frantically climbing up the tree, we have this close up of his face, which looks, terrified. So all of this appears to me to be, it appears to have been multiple shots and very directed. And so I'm wondering, if the filmmakers ever talked about this aspect of the film, or did they ever respond to this idea that the documentary might not have been as cinema verite as they would like us to believe? And what's your take, given your experience as a documentary filmmaker, what is your take on this aspect of the film?
Jacopetty and Prosperi never, I of course not never, but it is not recorded. It's not clear. I think they thought of themselves and presented themselves very much as documentary filmmakers. And so what they said officially was that they had gone to Africa, to all of these places. They had been on this great adventure and taken all of this and made all of this footage. I think that was, yeah, it's generally accepted that that's not necessarily true, that they sourced the material from many different filmmakers. But also, Luke, you mentioned cinema verite, and the heritage of cinema verite is very much that filmmakers rarely shot sound and pictures together. Usually they would tape the conversations, the interviews, the different opinions, and select the best material, and then film visual material to fit into the sound, and then cut it together in post. So yeah, I think in many respects, what we think about as documentary is a relatively contemporary form of filmmaking. And I don't know that it necessarily existed at this time beyond, like outside of the realms of journalism. But in that respect, I'm grateful, because it certainly gave me a lot of liberty in looking at this material, and a lot of freedom about to do with a lot of freedom around thinking about what was possible to do with this material and how it was possible to narrate it. And in the many different versions that I arrived at in the process of writing and editing for this film, it really gave me the freedom to think about my voice as a voice that could be added to the structure of the film in a way that didn't necessarily interfere with anybody's artistic or intellectual right. I don't know if that answers your question.
It absolutely does. Thanks, Renée.
Maybe we could speak a little bit about the burden of representation. It just struck me listening to you that, you are reclaiming, as a Kenyan woman, you're claiming a sort of montage documentary style film made by two Italian men a generation or two back. Here we are in dialogue, a white South African woman, a black Kenyan woman, Luke with his mixed Canadian Italian heritage sitting on the South American continent right now. And it makes me curious about your thinking around the reception of the piece. I think it would be incredibly tedious for you to have to explain all of the nuances of the film as you are aware of them from a Kenyan perspective, and you obviously have a very deep relationship to every bit of imagery and sound in the film. In particular, you use some astonishing bursts of music, and I know that each of these has been hand selected and is completely woven into your general concerns in the film. So without wanting to suggest that you should be responsible for unpacking all of these and explaining all of these to people who haven't done their homework and who are not familiar with the story of this part of the world, I'm curious about your thinking in, as to do you have a designated audience in mind for this film? Do you anticipate having to finesse your relationship with your audience differently from one context to another? I can imagine that a Kenyan audience would receive this very, very differently from a German audience, for example. So that must have been something that was sort of, stewing in your head as you're putting it together.
First I will say I don't think of myself as Kenyan. Like, I am from Nairobi, and that is a very specific place and a very small place in many respects. So looking at this footage and learning about the places that this film traveled to was a way for me as well to think and to learn about Kenya, because my understanding of Kenya has always been from the perspective of Daniel Toroitich arap Moi or Kenyatta, Jomo Kenyatta. It's not a place that I had necessarily experienced growing up, because I grew up in Nairobi, and it's a very localized urban identity. I think that I am confident that there are some people that will understand this film and every single nuance that I am embedded in the material. But I think at the same time, it is a story that is also the story of, you know, post-independence Ghana, or post-independence DRC, or many places to whom this narrative, or many places and many people to whom this narrative will be familiar, simply because there is a shared political context and a shared political language. And yeah, I think whether or not you understand the languages of the film, or any languages, or if we have any languages at all in common, there will be hints to a specific time and to a specific period. And which is why I thought in particular, I agree with you that the music, while I thought it was, you know, I think it's interesting, I also think it's important, because that gives you some heavy signals, you know, big brass bands and all of that exists inside of a heritage of like a certain type of militarized masculinity, choral music as well, I think gives you certain hints. So yeah, I don't know. I think I don't feel necessarily all that much pressure for everybody to understand it right now. I don't understand it all myself, as it exists now, but I think that I hope that certainly it will open up a place for like a shared understanding of like a certain kind of world, or a certain kind of world building, world making. So I don't know. I don't know necessarily that I ever had any ambitions while making it for it to travel. For me, it was important to make it to understand myself. And it's been 2 years of us talking and working and learning. And I think that I do have a better understanding of a lot of the issues that had come up for me in the writing of the glossary. So yeah, I'm of two minds, certainly. I think everybody will find like a little bit of fun, a little bit of humor. Luke, you mentioned this man with his teeth, and you know, in Kenya we call that like he has a nice dental detail, and so like that might be funny, or yeah. So hopefully, so everybody that sees it finds something that they can resonate with. And if not, then I'm happy to speak about it, because I'm finding ways to express these things as well myself.
I think it's so beautiful and so interesting the way it yields in different ways to one, depending on you know what one brings to it and who one is. I think that unfortunately within the forecast format, we've probably used up our time, so we're going to have to carry on this conversation outside of the Zoom. But I would just like to say a huge thank you, Renée, for sharing more thoughts and more richness around a piece which already, I have to say, every time I watch it, offers me different layers of meaning and different ways into it. Luke, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this piece several times, bring really thoughtful questions to it, and thank you very much to Forecast for hosting us all here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.